Okay, tell me I'm not the only one. You spend hours crafting an ultimate list of great books. You thoughtfully include Socratic style discussions with your students. You basically make learning awesome. Truth, goodness, beauty, you are all over it. And then a few years, or maybe months, or worse, weeks, days later, the children don't seem to remember any of it. You might ask them, like, don't you remember when we did this amazing thing? And they kind of look at you with that expression. Well, not really. Only in my family. Well, my parents classically educated me before it was cool. And I think that this second generation perspective gives me a unique insight. You see, my parents gave me an amazing education. It was rich in language, and great books, and original sources, and philosophy, and discussion, and hands-on application, and wonder, and delight, and adventures. But there are so many details that I can no longer remember. So was all that classical education or all that reading a waste if I can't remember all the main points, let alone the details? If education is merely the accumulation of knowledge, then my forgetfulness over the course of decades likely means my education failed. It's tempting now as a teacher to get a little grumpy about the perceived waste of my time and effort. In fact, why bother classically educating at all if our children, our students, sometimes don't seem to really remember much of anything? I mean, isn't classical education all about memorizing stuff? But do we really actually classically educate merely in order to absorb and regurgitate detailed lists of knowledge? Okay, if I can also be a little bit more controversial at this point, I would even assert that virtue alone cannot be the end of our classical education. If we're taking a simple pagan or Aristotelian definition of virtue all on its own without further clarification. Aristotle claimed that virtue is the ability to act in accordance with what one knows to be right. A Christian classical education, on the other hand, actually is constantly demonstrating to us and our children our inability to act in accordance with what we learn to be right. As we pursue this Christian classical education, we come face to face with the glorious heights of what is true, good, and beautiful. And we're properly humbled to realize how far short we fall from these ideals. But something more is required than mere intellectual knowledge of what is virtuous. We must love the one who is holiness himself, who is virtue incarnate. And it is that love of a person that transforms us, or as the Apostle Paul says, compels us to pursue lives of piety. And apart from that transformative love, we will have merely produced very moral heathens, or as Scott and Jane put it in their book, The Liberal Arts Tradition, we'll have raised smart pagans. Obedience without love for Christ is death. I believe that actually Christian classical education's greatest strength, what makes it worth pursuing, why I am a Christian classical educator, is found, in fact, in the character of God himself. Classical education is unique in that it looks to and pursues ideals that exist outside of ourselves. And this humility and posture of submission in education is referenced by C.S. Lewis in his work, The Abolition of Man. He said, quote, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality." Lewis then sets this in contrast to the modern desire to, quote, "subdue reality to the wishes of men," unquote. We hear a lot about the transcendentals, about truth, goodness, and beauty, but I think it's important to remember that they are not themselves autonomous. These transcendentals flow from a transcendent God. He is outside the system, not under the sun. His very nature defines truth, goodness, and virtue. They have no meaning apart from the one who is the eternally true and holy one. Jonathan Edwards once said, "Divine knowledge and divine love go together. A spiritual view of divine things always excites love in the soul and draws forth the heart in love to every proper object." Do you hear echoes there of Augustine's concept of ordo amoris? This is why a Christian classical education ought to drive us to wonder, to awe, to worship, and to delight. This is also why classical education is not irrevocably bound to a particular time, place, or culture. There is a way in which we can classically educate across cultures because we are pursuing transcendent truth that exists outside of cultural bounds.